period in the sort of mid to late 90s when he was a guardian. Maybe give us a word or two on that. Okay, Joe.
On the cable, yeah.
Yeah, we're doing okay. Yes, I wanted to say thanks, especially Cardinal Sean, because I thought it was describing my life when he was talking this afternoon, the different things, very episodes that we had been through there. When I was thinking about what happened to us as students, we lived during the years when there was a council going on, and I look back with great gratitude to Bob McCreary because he was so busy with so many things, and we used to all chuckle a little bit because I don't think he slept during the night. Every class he brought in these piles of the old-fashioned, we didn't have a Xerox machine, we had this alcohol run thing, so we were all sort of like on drugs during class when he'd bring these in there. But really such a valiant effort, and I want to second what he had to say about Father Miles Schmidt, because he was the one that really took so much criticism when he was the guardian, because he was trying to implement a lot of things that came out in the council, and there were a lot of friars who didn't really understand what was going on there, but he really was a great leader, sort of took the brunt of a lot of the criticism, but continued on. All was not perfect. I think when we look back, there's a way we sort of look at golden years. The first thing that came to my mind when Paul asked me to say a couple things tonight was that, well, probably the most eventful thing that happened in my guardianship was that Paul Dressler was here as a student. But we don't have time for all those stories. But I was thinking of also that things go smoothly and then they don't go smoothly. A little thing, we used to have a lot of help outs over at St. Gabriel's. We had a great contact with them, and in those years we were doing a lot of singing, a lot of four-part work, and we used to go over there as a choir. But then, because we had close connections, they would invite our friars if they were acolytes or deacons. And I can remember I was glad to see Cyrus was here this evening, because it made me think of Michael Scully from the Mid-America province, whose very famous episode at St. Gabriel's was that we were taking parts reading the Passion, and he was the deacon, so he was the narrator, and he was so nervous. He was so afraid to be reading in public and like that. And of course, it influenced him a little bit, because when he got to the part in the Garden of Eden, you remember, he said, he pulled out his sword and cut off his Peter. But the thing was, it was so funny, was the people in the congregation didn't blink an eye. We were going crazy. I mean, we could hardly sing or say anything like that for us. We made him a wonderful book afterwards, and about every third page, we had a picture of somebody, some cartoon carrying, saying, "Cut off his what?" So there were also some light moments in that. The thing that I wanted to share about that stuck in my mind, one of many things when I was the guardian, was that those were the years when we did the second renovation of the chapel. One of the things that Father Miles took a lot of flack for was that in the late 60s we had the first very amateur reconstruction of the chapel, and this was a cause for great dissent and great sorrow. There were many friars who were really hoping that we would keep the decor as we saw it in the past. You've seen the famous postcard. It gets posted every once in a while. People remind us that there was this very technically very elegant art. It was Syrian art, sort of imported, and that was sort of done with a very deep artistic background, because the cross of San Damiano was also a Syrian kind of art that was brought into Italy at the time, just before the life of St. Francis. So we went through the second, and it just took us forever. The crew came in, and they had a limited number of workers. So they destroyed the chapel, so we couldn't possibly use it. And then we went downstairs where the task people are. And we had a beautiful space down there to use as our liturgy. And what I remember are two things about that. One was that the company didn't want to do all the work they had agreed to do. And I was on the definitory with Frank, and Frank said, well, you're on the scene down there. Why don't you make sure that they've done everything on the checklist, and then we'll release the last payment to them. One of the things they were supposed to do was that little pocket door. You know, when you go into the chapel, to your right, you can take the steps downstairs to the lower room. They put it off, they didn't do it. And they came, I counted, I had 12 meetings with them. They said, well, you know, we're so substantially finished, you could go ahead and sign it off and like that. And I learned how to say this. Well, I would love to pay you, but as soon as that pocket door is done, it went on for months and months and months. Finally, they did it. The last thing I wanted to tell you was about the San Damiano cross itself. You know that in 1953 was the first time for centuries that the people of God were allowed to see the San Damiano cross, because when San Damiano itself was closed and the sisters came in and were protected, their families wanted them to be inside the city walls, they of course brought with them the cross that had spoken to St. Francis. And after the Second World War, the bishops of Umbria asked the Holy Father and asked the sisters if there wasn't some way that they could get that cross made accessible to people. And finally they did, and the sisters divided the time. During the night the sisters would have access to it, and in the daytime, those of you who have been to Assisi know when you go to Santa Chiara Church, you can go in and see the original. And that triggered a tremendous amount of interest in the San Damiano cross. Now we just take it for granted. We have these images, but it was so out of sight that people began to try to draw the cross just on the basis of hearsay, so on. Many times they were very wrong. They didn't understand what was there. So this, in the 1950s, gave access to the cross, and people started to do research on it. And when I was ready, I was working in Rome, and I was ready to come back home to the province, and I had made friends with an artist up in Assisi. And I said to him, would you be able to make, according to specifications, a cross that we could use, a canvas in our chapel? And he said, oh yes, we can do that. But then he asked me a question. He said, you know, for a long time we have been making the image of the cross as it is now, darkened by candle, smoke, and sort of, you know, not very easy to distinguish. But he said, now they have finished the research. We know the colors, the way that cross looked when it was maybe only 20 years old, done by Syrian monks working under the influence of Italian artists. And we could make a cross for you that shows the colors that St. Francis saw, or we can make it in the dark one. Of course, I said, well, let's go for the colors. Let's see it the way St. Francis saw it. And we brought it here. They rolled up the canvas. Brother Alfred went out to the airport with me, and we brought it back. And we set it up on the workhorses, and he made the frame, and he painted it white. And as we were finishing, I was helping him, as we were finishing, a woman came to the door. And she came in, she said, I heard that you have a San Damiano cross image here. She said, I've got great devotion to this. I wonder if I could look at it. And we said, of course. She brought her into the chapel. She said, I also work for the Smithsonian Institute. And we have just finished a massive project because we have developed a plastic cover that we're putting on our paintings, which will greatly reduce the loss of color when they're exposed to the sunlight. She says, I have a lot of it left over. Would you like us to do this for you? And I said, how much would it cost? She said, totally free. So she brought the workers from the museum itself, brought it up, and they painted the cross, and the rest, as they say, is history. So just want to share those little things.
Amen.